Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started here. Thank you all for joining us for the first ethics session of the conference. My name is Jill Quigley. I'm with Tyndale Oliver. I'm gonna do formal introductions later, but I was privileged to work with these three people last year on another ethics session about privilege, and we decided to do part 2 this year. So I hope that you all will find it as enjoyable as last year's session. So to start with introductions, today we have with us Jim Barnes. Jim is the village manager for the Village of Wellington. He has over 30 years of experience in the public and private sectors in planning and development. He serves on the boards of the Florida Green Building Coalition and Florida Planning and Zoning Association, and is a credentialed manager by both ICMA and a certified Parks and Recreation professional by the NRPA. And Jim is also a member of the APA Florida EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. We also have with us this morning Bob Cambric, who is an urban planner specializing in public policy, growth management, community redevelopment, economic development, and consensus building. He holds a Master of Science in Planning and Bachelor of Arts of International Affairs from Florida State University, with over 30 years of urban planning and implementation experience. Bob has assisted citizens and organizations to identify and reach consensus on a range of diverse issues, including neighborhood redevelopment, water quality protection, coastal development, and emergency preparedness. Bob is also a member of the APA Florida EDI Committee and was recently elected to the Board of Directors for Thousand Friends of Florida, as well as the Florida Solar and Energy Loan Fund. And then myself, I'm Jill Quigley. I am a senior associate and the office leader with Tyndale Oliver in Fort Lauderdale. I have over 27 years of experience, both public and private sector, mostly in transportation and NEPA work. And then also with us today is Alissa Barber Torres. She has over 27 years of planning experience in local government, private sector, and regional planning agencies, and is a fellow of the AICP. She holds a Master's of Science in Urban and Regional Planning from Florida State University and a Ph.D. in Text and Technology from the University of Central Florida. She has extensive professional service and leadership at the local, state, and national levels and focuses on the growth and inclusivity of the urban planning profession. She is one of the co-chairs of the APA Florida EDI Committee. And I just want to mention a program note. We were supposed to have another panelist with us, Roxanne Reed, who is Alyssa's fellow co-chair of the EDI committee, but unfortunately Roxanne had a family emergency and couldn't join us. But Alissa has graciously agreed to cover Roxanne's slides. So I get to start with the boring part, reviewing the Code of Ethics. So I wanted to just go through a little bit of the history of the Code of Ethics. It was originally adopted in 2005, revised in 2016, and they're actually working on revisions this year, and they are expecting those revisions to be adopted in the fall of 2021. And they are basically reorganizing it and updating the language. We're keeping the 3 sections of the code that we've always had, the principles to which we aspire, the rules of conduct, and the procedures for enforcement, but they're making some changes within those sections. So for example, the principles to which we aspire are being expanded from 3 principles to 5. And one of the things I noted on the website that I thought was interesting, that one of the things they're also trying to do is reduce the use of frivolous complaints by an aggrieved member of the public by allowing only AICP members the option to file an appeal of a determination. So I think that's a good benefit for us. And for more information about these changes and the timeline, you can go to planning.org ethics. They've got some good information there. So I briefly wanted to highlight some of the edits to the principles to which we aspire. In our current code, we basically have 3 major categories, and they all are our responsibility to the public, to our clients and employers, and to our profession and colleagues. And what they're proposing, the change, it would change that language to people who participate in the planning process shall continuously pursue and faithfully serve the public interest, do so with integrity, work to achieve social justice and racial equity, safeguard the public trust, and improve planning knowledge and increase public understanding of planning activities. So we've essentially kept the same 3 we've had and just expanded them a little bit. They're also making edits to the rules of conduct. The current code has 26 rules, and right now the proposed edits have 26 rules, although they've combined some of them and they're proposing one new rule. I think the biggest change is that they're organizing the rules under 7 topic areas, which are shown here. And one of the new rules proposed under the quality and integrity of practice section will be to not deliberately nor with indifference fail to promote and accommodate public participation in the planning process. So I just wanted to review quickly the principles to which we aspire that's in the current code. We're going to be talking about several of these this morning as part of our presentation, but our first one is our overall responsibility to the public, where our primary obligation is to serve the public interest. And so some of the ones that are relevant to our discussion today are A, being conscious of the rights of others. I think C, paying attention to the interrelatedness of decisions, ensuring that accurate information is provided to all affected persons, giving people the opportunity to have meaningful impact on the development of plans and programs that affect them, and of course to seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunities for all persons. Our second overall principle is our responsibility to our clients and our employers, where we are required to provide diligent, creative, and competent performance of work consistent with our faithful service to the public interest. And then the third and the biggest category is our responsibility to our profession and our colleagues, which is to contribute to the development of and respect for our profession. And some of these principles will also be highlighted in our discussion today. Enhancing the integrity of our profession, and increasing opportunities for members of underrepresented groups to become professional planners and help them advance. And so the last part I wanted to cover was just a review of the ethics cases and calls in 2020. So this graph shows you the 21 misconduct cases that were filed in 2020. The bulk of them were dismissed, with 42% of them being dismissed with no charges, and 26 being dismissed even though charges were filed. 26 were settled, and there are 6%, which is 3 cases, still pending. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, if you look at the different types of rules of conduct that were cited in these cases, in the first one, under settled, someone had a 1-year suspension of their AICP certification for derogatory comments on social media and in email correspondence. And so to me, that was very interesting and kind of shows the new world we're in, and that we can be brought up for violation of ethics for what we do on social media. This graphic shows the requests for informal advice that were made in 2020. I don't really have anything insightful about this. I just thought it was a nice, pretty graph. Give you lots of colors. And this shows where all those calls and cases occurred throughout the country. My insightful comment on this is thanks to California, Florida was not number 1. And thanks to Region 4, which has a lot of states in it, our region also was not number 1. But to me, it was pretty shocking to look at this and see the number of cases and calls that were made against Florida planners. That total number is 16 in 2020. And then I just wanted to close with, if anybody wants to file a complaint or make an inquiry, they now have a complaint form on the website that is how you would make a formal complaint, or to seek an informal advice, you call the AICP ethics officer. And so with that, I am done, and I am going to turn it over to Bob.
Okay. Hey there, good morning. How's everyone doing? And everyone wanting to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, you won't learn any much from me, but the other people, they're great. So with that, just simply give me a second. One of the things that we try to make sure that we're doing as planners is being able to communicate in ways that are common. And so what we've been able to do when we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I believe it was in 2019, APA came up with their diversity, and this is the other part, you have to remember who's saying it because the words change around sometimes, but the order, equity, diversity, inclusion, their vision statement. And so it's up there. And my easy way of trying to talk about this is, right now, before I stood up, I took a look around the room. And what I can visually try to figure out in terms of diversity is, what am I seeing? So if you're a planner and you're working as a local government, as a consultant, wherever it happens to be, and you're trying to do good planning, and you're working with the community, and you look out and you don't see the representative aspect of that community, and you should know beforehand, take a look at the demographics. You'll know what the racial compositions happen to be. And if you don't, racial, gender, LGBTQ, disability status, and if you're not seeing that represented in the room, then what are you doing? You need to then figure out why aren't they there, and what can you do to get them there, both in the short term and the long term. That's diversity. Inclusion. Inclusion for me is very simple. You can bring me to the table, and I can sit there and I can tell you I'm tired of the fact that my neighborhood doesn't get the same services because I'm a community of color. And I keep coming back and I keep coming back, and you say, thanks for coming, but nothing changes. That's not inclusion. Inclusion is not only am I at the table, but you're hearing what I have to say, and the end result is what I had to say is reflected in what you're doing, whether it's a planning process, planning document, or actual outcomes in terms of neighborhood services or anything else. So we're not window dressing, it's not tokenism, it is actually including our valuable and needed opinions in the process. Equity, very simply, is when you begin to treat everyone the same, always. Always. Now, interestingly, one of the things I tried to look at was the idea of, let's take it back to the beginning. And as planners, we always start with understanding the demographics and what the data is telling us. And we're, from our larger planning processes, starting with the comp planning process. When we started it both in 1975, with the Local Government Planning Act then, and then in 85 with the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Land Development Regulation Act. Whoever said that, came up with that, must really love words. But nevertheless, those planning processes, they all say, go and look at the data and see what it says. And I was there doing reviews at a regional planning council of the plans that were first adopted in North Florida. And what you would see then in both the future land use and the housing elements, there was data. It was broken down, and they would tell you the racial, ethnic data as well as gender data. And so people followed through with that. Not so much these days. Right now, if you review a comprehensive plan, just your population is homogeneous. It just simply says, here's our past population, present population, projected population. Same thing in terms of CRA plans. CRA plans are supposed to be consistent with the comp plan, but more often you're dealing with a CRA plan, you're dealing with areas of blight and areas that are in economic distress. And if someone were to sit down and do a Venn diagram of CRA areas and minority communities, they probably are just sitting on top of each other. But yet, when you look at CRA plans, you would not see that there are any people of color, anyone with disabilities, that may be living in those communities and having needs. And so what winds up happening is, so you have that same thing in the long-range transportation planning process. Interestingly, especially in the transit area, the question is, if the data is assuming everyone is equal, then the outcomes mean that the benefits inure equally, and they don't. And so what we need to start doing is going back and being realistic, looking at what the data says, and then also looking at, based on the data, are there differing needs based on the differing populations who make up our community? I don't know the answer to that because, number one, as a person of color, as a gay man, there's no monolithic voice. I mean, mine is an excellent voice, is one you should listen to. Do what I say now. But there's no monolithic voice, and so you need to engage. I said this yesterday in the planning officials training session, especially one of the things when it comes to communities of color, African American people, please find more than one black person in your community that you turn to for advice. Tomorrow I will be ordained as a minister of the Church of Bob, and so officially I'm now an expert for the black community once I become a reverend. So turn to someone more than the reverend in your community or the revered African American female that has been around and interested in what's happening in your community. They're great to talk to, they're great people, but they're not necessarily the sole voice. It doesn't matter if it's African American, Latino, Hispanic, gay, lesbian, transgendered. There's more than one person representing that community, and there's a diversity of opinions that need to be represented. Bring them to the table. And the reason why you need to bring them to the table, before I get to that, and I'm not attempting to castigate the Florida chapter American Planning Association, but I do want to ask a question for you to consider. One of the things that we've been doing over the years is that we've been designating great places in Florida. It's an award of distinction. And I went and I looked at recent recipients of great places. Excuse me. I got to get these old eyes to be able to see the great places. But recent recipients: Stewart, Pensacola, Fernandina Beach, Mount Dora, Winter Garden. These communities, they're not really serving people of color. And so if our planning fails to provide awards for communities of color, what are we saying? That those communities don't matter? Those communities aren't capable of being great places? And so the outcomes of the planning process, when you begin to treat communities as homogeneous, and you applaud those homogeneous communities as being great, what you're also saying to those non-homogeneous communities is maybe your voice and maybe your needs are not as important. And so in closing, there were a couple of images and things I want you to look at. Ralph Ellison, I'm an invisible man. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. There's no greater disability in society than the ability to see a person as more. You never completely have rights, one person, until all of you, until you all have your rights. If you don't know, Marsha P. Johnson was a transgender female who actually was one of the individuals that was instrumental in the starting in the Stonewall riots. And it shouldn't be called Stonewall riots. It should be called the Stonewall Stop Messing with Me. That was a good edit. Stop messing with me and get me be a person. And so with that, I was supposed to try to set the table And so I'm now, I believe, turning to Jim. And thank you very much for your time. I hope I said something that is useful. Have a good day.
Good morning, everyone. Alissa Barber Torres. As Jill mentioned, I'm delivering Roxanne Reed's presentation. Unfortunately, she was not able to be with us today. I will go through this material rather quickly, not just because Bob is the proverbial tough act to follow, always, but because, of course, we want to save the most time for your engagement, questions, and suggestions at the end. So forgive me for going through this quickly. Happy to answer any questions. As Jill had just highlighted for us, so I won't spend a lot of time here, there are several aspects of the AICP Code of Ethics that relate to the disability community, and we'll be exploring those in more detail in just a moment. But first, Roxanne thought it was important to have us all contemplate for a moment the difficult history of the disability community and the fact that people with disabilities have experienced discrimination and harm around the world for centuries. And if we think to the mayor's remarks this morning, the need for empathy, this is truly a moment for us to get in touch with that emotion as we think about the difficult items that are listed here in terms of what people have suffered over the years. But I think the inspiring thing about it, in which we'll see in just a moment, is how some of these attitudes have changed over time and hopefully will change more. And again, looking at that difficult history, she wanted us to highlight for you how the Nazis have used programs for euthanasia to exterminate people with disabilities throughout Europe, which led to the Holocaust and more significant effects of genocide. And what she felt was important here to note is that, as we have seen so many times in different communities, if we don't take the appropriate action at the appropriate time to make a more inclusive community, how things can move forward in a way that is increasingly tragic for all of us. So again, starting to look at a more positive history and some of the recent trends. Of course, the 1960s brought significant change to disability communities of many types, as the President's Panel on Mental Retardation and the Special Olympics highlighted the strengths and needs of disability communities, and parents' movements to improve conditions in state institutions, which are a tragic part of that history, began to challenge conventional wisdom and showed that people with disabilities can contribute a lot to the broader community, and the closure of asylums and institutions that had contained people for so long began to come forward. And parents took action and filed lawsuits, forcing states to recognize the civil and legal rights of children. And of course, that type of action, unfortunately, has to continue until we get to the place we need to recognize the rights of children with different abilities. But the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was an important step forward that established legal precedent for disability as a protected category in law. Another significant milestone in this history is Public Law 94-192 in 1975, which made important steps forward in public education. Tragically, at that time the law was passed, over 1 million children with disabilities in the U.S. were completely excluded from education, and over half of U.S. children with disabilities had only limited or part-time education. So the law addressed these injustices with access and protection of children's rights, and we began to see increasing support for people with disabilities in our community. Turning now to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1990, this is another important step forward that led to the development of supportive services like day programs and assistive technology, and helped people with different abilities transition from school to work and receive the appropriate accommodations in those settings. It's important to note that 80% of people with disabilities in the U.S. are not in the labor force, compared to 30% of the community that has no disability, and that 29% of workers with a disability are part-time, compared to 16% of the population overall. And when we look at increasing the access for underrepresented groups, as Jill highlighted for us a moment ago, that is certainly key in making sure that we can improve on the conditions we see right now. And before I move on in this presentation, I want to draw your attention to the photo with Mickey and Roxanne's youngest son, Ben, who has autism and is employed at Walt Disney World using some of the same accommodations that these laws brought about. And Roxanne, of course, means to honor him because he's an important part of the advocacy and passion that she brings to equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And again, she shows his potential, his possibility, and his future. An important part of the history of disability, of the disability community is also the Capitol Crawl, which a photo is highlighted here to show that this important milestone advocated for the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act by demonstrating the impacts of inaccessible built environments and how they barred people's access to public life in their communities. Approximately 60 people crawled up these steps. The youngest was 8 years old, and her name is Jennifer Keenan. By that point, she had been an activist for 2 years and had already been arrested. So I think that highlights for us the potential that we all have to make a difference in our community, regardless of our age or circumstances. And this Capitol Crawl helped lead to passage of the ADA on July 26, 1990. It's important to note that all local governments are required to have ADA self-evaluation and transition plans to do the retrofits needed in the right-of-way to make them more accessible and comply with law. This is under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and Title II of ADA. Because the streets belong to everyone, these are important rules and actions to take to make sure we meet that need of all people, and the adoption of the public right-of-way accessibility guidelines is pending, which will create even better standards for accessibility in the built environment and the transportation network. So I encourage you all to go back to your agencies and make sure that they are in a good position to both implement the transition plan that they hopefully already have, because not everyone does, and to greet the pending adoption of PROWAG. Turning now to the community, of course, there are a number of ways that we can plan for and with people with disabilities. And that community benefits from universal design, public parks, products, and buildings, ADA compliance in a number of aspects of the built environment listed here, supportive housing, and the very process of engagement with people with disabilities, which, of course, is key to the code of ethics and how we are conscious of the rights of others. In the workplace, again, supported employment, accommodations, which can often be very simple and directly provided at a low cost to be able to help people with disabilities perform to their full potential in the workplace environment. Education and diversity and inclusion training to address conscious and unconscious bias that people in the workplace may not even realize that they have, but limits the potential of everyone. So Roxanne has presented a brief case study for us to reflect on for a moment. And in this case study, you're a planning supervisor in a small rural town that's hiring a planner for your team. Your agency interviews 2 applicants. One has a bachelor's degree in planning and the other has some college and experience in another town. Both interviewed well. Since the town is small, a member of the interview panel knows the applicant with the planning degree and tells the team they have a learning disability, although they did not request accommodations on their application. The planning director, who is not AICP, expresses some concerns. So Roxanne asked us to reflect upon, based on the code of ethics, what you would recommend to the planning director. And so giving this a moment for us to think back to the principles that Jill presented to us a moment ago. Of course, the Code of Ethics asks us to always be conscious of the rights of others, to expand the choice and opportunity for all persons in terms of our responsibilities to the public. And when we look to the aspirational principles, responsibilities to the profession and colleagues, as she highlighted for us, of course, we have the responsibility as AICP planners to ensure that underrepresented members of different communities can become planners, and more importantly, in some ways, to advance in the profession. As Bob highlighted, it's not enough to just have the person in the chair. We all need to be working to create workplaces and communities that allow each one of us sitting in this room and in the broader profession to be able to access the leadership, the projects, and the positions that all of our talent and experience have earned. So we are happy to be able to talk with you today about how to do that, and we thank you for your efforts in that mission. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Jim.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us here. And as Jill mentioned earlier, this kind of was an evolutionary thing where we wanted to try and take up the spot where we left off last year. And I think largely, we hit a lot more targets than we originally even intended. So I think it's a good thing. You guys can be the judge of that. And ultimately, as a village manager, one thing that I'm aware of is you always look in the room and you always recognize any elected officials or officials that are running for office. But I don't know anybody in the room right now, but I will recognize one person who's here, past president of APA and current AICP president, Mr. Mitchell Silver is joining us and is in the room and hopefully will give us a good grade after this session from the AICP Code of Ethics perspective. The session my portion of this session was to look more at our workplaces and see how diversity, inclusion fits into our workplaces. Less so specifically just in the communities we serve, which is critical. But in a lot of cases, what we end up seeing is that, one way to help serve our communities better is to have staff and workmates that are reflective of the community that you do serve. And so, generally one thing we've noticed in the last year and a half or so is that when you look at our hybrid meetings, you were really able to get a feel for what either your community, your committee, your council, your community engagement group looked like. And, one thing in some cases, it was eye-opening, where if you looked at it, there was not a change in the hue of skin tone in the meeting. There was not a change in the age group. In a lot of cases, some of those Zoom or GoToMeeting or Microsoft Team grids was a lot of pale, male, and stale faces. A lot of old white guys that are just hanging out, and they're the same ones that always come to the table with comments. So that's not to say their comments are bad or inaccurate, but is it really reflective of your entire community, given whether you've got pockets of diversity in your community or scattered diversity, either way? For the last couple of years in particular, that diversity issue has taken on a lot of discussion at the national level, state level, even the local level. And it's actually driving a lot of the things we look at from an economic standpoint, from a political structure and social structure standpoint. So it's interesting to look at it now, trying to figure out, even corporate entities are starting to look at it and dedicate more time to foster that culture of inclusion. One, nod, while Bob might sometimes, and I join him many times, and maybe looking more critically at APA, Florida APA, or national APA in general. One thing that has led, at least baby steps, is that the APA has recently adopted, for the first time in its history, a diversity and inclusion strategy. And, that didn't happen by accident. It happened with a lot of trailblazing folks who led the way for that. But interestingly enough, one of the things that contributed in that study is back in 2016, and I'll double check some numbers here to make sure that I'm looking at it correctly, is that I think in a survey in 2016 that was conducted by APA in that a 40-year period, less than 30% of APA planners with 20 more years of experience were women, and 7% were minority planners. And the interesting tidbit now, as a result of this new strategy and some recent data collection, is that at least the graduates coming out of planning school or planning-related school, if that we want to call it that, is 45% women and 15% minority. So, we're making some progress, I guess, and that's a good thing. So what is this inclusion issue, and how does it fit into, our workplaces? And really what we need to look at is we need to, it's one thing to say, well, I've got a diverse workforce, but on an inclusion standpoint, you've got to look at, people of varying cultural backgrounds, and they're welcome. Everybody's treated with respect. Everybody feels included and integrated into your culture, and they're given equal access and opportunities in the environment, your workplace environment. And lastly, that they're given opportunities to contribute, not just being able to be at the table, but actually contribute their ideas and concerns, because it's important to get both. So looking at that, just some interesting things that while we are doing a decent job, I think, of trying to get diverse workforces, and some workplaces do a good job of technically, recruiting and even retaining, but we're still not necessarily getting that inclusion part right. And here's some examples, in industry and tech in particular. So, what you have is a couple pictures there that demonstrate the failure of passport scanner manufacturers on the tech side of the world to have more diverse testers, diverse input, and diverse designers. Because you look at the two pictures, in one picture, the scan of the picture indicated that you might need to retake the picture or scan a new picture in because your eyes appear to be closed. They're not closed, they're open. It's just that that software, that mechanical process that was constructed, did not recognize for people of different facial characteristics and features based on their background. Similarly, the other picture indicates that you may want to submit another picture because your mouth is open. And the gentleman said, no, I just have big lips. And again, another example showing that there's not really a lot of integration and inclusion in perhaps the people that are testing this. Interestingly enough, while I think the Apple Watch may have debuted in like 2016, 2015, that time frame, it wasn't really promoted till about 2019 that it could track a woman's menstrual cycle. And, so while you've got this great diverse company, again, something that would be important in a whole host of other health-related applications took that long to get out there. And lastly, another crazy example is, again, back in the tech side of things, the racist soap dispenser actually happening in Atlanta at a Marriott, where you had a situation where, based on skin tone, soap would not dispense. So clearly, again, testers, people who are designing these types of things, did not have necessarily, they might have had diverse staff, but clearly there was not any inclusion when they're looking at testing some of this stuff. Silly ideas to think about. Again, so let's see, I guess I went the wrong direction there. No, I didn't. Maybe there's just an extra slide. We'll go to this one. Basically, so, Vernee Myers, who is the VP of Diversity and Inclusion at Netflix. Previously, she's still an attorney, but previously was in practice looking at that aspect of the law, has coined or at least popularized the term that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And it's one of those weird things where, you have the situation, everybody, maybe you crushed it in middle school, maybe you didn't, but your middle school dances where you had people dancing or you had people hanging out on the wall waiting and trying to figure out, am I going to jump on the dance floor, am I going to get asked, what have you. It's interesting to note that even in those situations where you say, well, hell, you got to go ahead and grab a glove, get in the game, and if nobody's asking you to dance, just get out there and start moving it. There's still folks in that room that are in charge and setting up the rules and making the rules of engagement, so to speak, as to who's dancing and who gets to dance and what music's playing. So it's almost one of those things that maybe we need to look at, and maybe this is a jumping off point for next year, is we looked at diversity, you look at inclusion, diversity being asked to the party, inclusion being asked to dance. Maybe we need to look at belonging as well. And if you belong, maybe they're using your playlist to be able to go ahead and get the party started. And that's a big difference of just being there and showing up. So what you've got is basically, what are the barriers we see then based on these issues we see in our work environment and what happens? So some barriers to inclusion. And a lot of times what ends up happening with their barriers to inclusion, they're not necessarily conscious efforts to try and not have diversity or not to include people, even though you have a diverse workforce. A lot of times it ends up being something that plays to our unconscious bias that Alissa referred to earlier. And, there's nothing wrong with unconscious bias. We all have it. The part of the process that's important is to actually acknowledge what you have and try and address those. But what you hear in a lot of places, both in the public sector or even in the private sector, is, I'm hiring the best person for the job. Not necessarily the most qualified, but the best person. I'm hiring somebody that's a great fit. Cultural fit, any kind of fit. Well, a lot of times that's really code for I'm hiring somebody like me. I'm hiring somebody who's a bro who I can go have some beers with. I'm hiring people that I want to feel comfortable in my circle. And whereas that may not necessarily bring you all the benefits of having a really diverse workforce and then having an inclusive workforce, by having varying opinions. So that's what normally can be referred to as organizational preference. And what you end up seeing is that if what you bring to the table is narrowed by your blind spots and your organizational preference, you end up with a lot of the same thing. And, again, it's easy to just hire people that look like you and hang out, and like I said, probably a bunch of groovy guys and great at frat parties, but again, all the same people. Or just, again, organizational preference that, again, surrounding yourself with people who look just like you and think just like you. And what you end up with there is this culture fit buzzword, this culture fit code word that everybody uses. You end up hiring basically an echo chamber because everybody's going to be thinking the same thing and saying the same thing you are. So, a lot of things play into what the diversity lens goes into. You look at your individual personality. You look at your internal experiences and background, race, ethnicity, age, et cetera, gender. And then you look at external. Again, different points that a lot of times refer to privileges we may or may not have, whether it's socioeconomic status, education, life experiences, geographically where you're from within the region, and that type of thing, all the way to even your fully externalized experiences related to the era, and that relates to your age and how you grew up and that kind of thing. Just to give you an idea where I'm coming from, as a member of the EDI committee, I bring something to the table. My lens is I was born and raised in the Philippines. I'm multiracial, but largely on both sides of the spectrum. Having spent 10 years there initially and moved to this country in 1977, I've largely experienced and lived a white existence. I've benefited from white privilege. But my lens is still driven to some extent, having had that background and grown up in a foreign country. And interestingly enough, having been the outsider looking in both sides, as crazy as that might sound. Again, not saying that I still benefited from basically white privilege. Growing up in the Philippines, my background was I was the American. I was the white kid. And so the minority, but not necessarily a minority that did not have any kind of power. Similarly, again, notwithstanding the fact that I had some great style, even at a young age, I grew up being different than all the kids that I went to school with. And as a result, that shaped, to some extent, how I interacted and how I continue to interact with people of different cultures. This probably speaks to the fact of why I ended up being a planner and not necessarily an engineer or an architect, because clearly I can't even assemble a simple hobby horse. But basically, that does shape how we look at things, because when I moved here to this country at the age of 11, I was still odd kid out. I was darker than most. Most of the kids I went to school with had no idea where the Philippines was back then. They didn't even know that there was some lady there who had like millions of shoes. But the reality is they said, you know what? You're kind of tan. You have a kind of weird accent, not the same as some of the other kids we know. You're some kind of Spanish. You're probably Cuban or Puerto Rican or something, but that's all right. We'll figure it out. And over time, I think I just kind of blended in. And then with a name like Jim Barnes, pretty easy to say, hey, yeah, he's just got a good tan, but he's a white guy. So hence where, again, my frame of reference. So cultural impacts is interesting. It's the worldview that you have. Really, it helps you interpret and how you look at things and how you bring things together. And it also depends on how you're presenting that in the space that you happen to be in. Whether it's what you're doing, what your titles are, whether it's more how things are culturally determined to evaluate how you support the performance within your organization. So, how do you do that? Let's go ahead and decide, looking at what's actually in our brains. So unconscious bias, it's slightly different than our cultural worldview, and it allows you, to basically process a lot of things, but you're missing some of the important issues that are out there based on the bias that you might have. And it also allows you to go ahead and, without really acknowledging it, hold negative stereotypes that ultimately impact, how you move forward. What you need to do is just admit be loud and proud about it, that you have biases. And you just need to do that and feel real therapeutic that, you acknowledged it, and everybody around you has them, and your brain's going to process it a certain way, and it's important that once you acknowledge it, that then you can at least try and, find where those blind spots are so that you can address them before they become a problem for you. Sometimes society around us fixes that problem for us. An example we have is in classical music. There seemed to be for a while there a real issue where there were not a heavy representation of females in classical music. So one thing that a lot of the different orchestras did was decide we're going to go to blind auditions. And that blind audition basically decided everybody's going to audition behind a curtain so you couldn't see who was actually doing that. There was a little bit of an increase, enough to notice that you started having more female representation in those orchestras. Interesting note, though, is that a secondary thing to go ahead and add to that is that there was even greater increase in female participation when they decided to go ahead and have them walk on stage without shoes, because you can still hear the heels on the floor of the orchestra concert stage. And so it was a way for people to go ahead and still, figure out, subconsciously. It's one of those things. Similarly, we'll take a little exercise for a minute. If I go and say, all right, we're going to visualize for a short while here, just a couple of seconds. And if you close your eyes and think, all right, I'm at the conference, you rushed, maybe you're far away, you go ahead and you're on a plane, you get on the plane, you're rushing. Just as you get on, they close the door behind you, you're happy, you got your seat. Pilot comes out, says hello to everybody, picks you out and says, really, hello. You get here, you're here last night, you have dinner, you see a lovely couple next to you at the dinner table, enjoying a dinner on their own. And then this morning, at the opening session, because of unscheduled, unplanned issue, you have the president of APA that shows up. Now, in any of those situations, as everybody was thinking through that, did anybody visualize a black pilot? Did anybody visualize a same-sex couple at the table next to them at dinner? And did anybody think that the APA president was a woman? Just something to think about, that you're just pre-wired. It's nothing bad. It's just the way things work subconsciously. You satisfy, so you're taking a lot of shortcuts, and those are easy shortcuts. They're not bad shortcuts. We just need to know we're taking them. And what happens is, because again, since particularly when it relates to race, but in general, any of the issues, whether we're looking at disabilities, whether we're looking at race and ethnic origin, whether we're looking at gender, in any of those situations, what we end up seeing is, you might have an illusion of objectivity that you have. And basically, if you look at the situation where the salaries of men and women, and people think, well, no, we're actually looking at it across the board, and we're being fair about it, and we're going ahead and trying to adjust accordingly. The fact that there's still some unconscious bias there is important to note. And one of those things is, we'll talk about it, it's prescriptive bias. So let's say, for example, since ethics sessions generally are good for case studies and little examples. So let's say Bill's a department head in your office, is talking to Jessica and Charles, who are two people he manages in the division. During a conversation, he's talking to him, and Bill says, my wife used to be a senior manager, but she had decided to stay home with the kids so she could be, because she couldn't be good at her job and a good mother at the same time. And basically, both Jessica and Charles, they hear this, and that basically, it's one of those prescriptive bias things that, you'd think that women in that situation couldn't do both jobs. And it's not, it's just something that is the ideas that go into those kind of scripted biases. And it would impact how he may look at Jessica when they're performing in the same manner as Bill, because Jessica may, in the future, have a child and decide to still be a working mom. So those are the example of prescriptive bias. Now, similarly, that example I gave you of the descriptive bias is that, those three instances of visualization we talked about, dinner, the airplane pilot and you're president of APA, that's a descriptive bias, just because we're pre-wired to go that way. And that's how it's normally supposed to work in our heads, because we're taking shortcuts. So what do you do to promote really inclusion? Is you go ahead and you try and look at it, reflect on your own experiences, and go ahead and when you're feeling included, when you come into the company, basically, do you consider how you felt coming in there? Small things matter. Don't make up people's names. If you don't know their name and you can't pronounce it, ask them how to pronounce it. And practice it a little bit, and you'll figure it out. But don't just keep coming up with a different way to pronounce it and just chalk it up to, I don't know how to say that. It's just a lot, small things, stupid things, like a lot of race and ethnicity ties back to, for some reason I didn't realize this, maybe because I'm somewhat hair challenged, but people's hair has a lot of issue to do with background. And so it's not something you want to reach out and go, hey, can I touch your hair? That's not cool. No matter how interesting it is, it's not cool to do. And kind of just, how do you do that? You just, that's how you stay on top of and promote inclusion, by not doing that kind of crap. And same thing is just even something as simple as, when do you call meetings? Try and be cognizant as who can attend, who can't attend. And if not everybody can attend a certain time, you keep calling, use a different time so that everybody can attend. Otherwise, it just seems, at some point, well, maybe it's not on purpose, but you're excluding people from being able to be participating in that process, and see what happens. Keep going as far as just even the language you use. And it's not that it's, good language, bad language, obscene language or anything like that, but basically just trying to use language that's basically understandable to all. Staying on top of your biases is important so that you can go and basically manage that unconscious bias you have, and stay on top of it, know where your blind spots are, and see what happens, and basically, so that you can try and slow down sometimes before you rush to that judgment that you're going to make, and look for the information that necessarily doesn't match up with how you're particularly thinking at the time. And what's important, and this goes to where you're really starting to go from just having a diverse workforce and maybe being able to retain a little bit of a diverse workforce, to going ahead and having more of an intentional inclusionary workforce and leading into the belonging part, is you need to actually go through and try and look beyond that, and in some cases interrupt bias where you have it pop up. You've got to go ahead and, if it's something that's still uncomfortable and it's weird and awkward, you need to go ahead and push back against it, and not necessarily say, let other people get away with comments that might be offensive to somebody that's in the group. And, it's kind of like when you're sitting at home, whether it's at a holiday or a family reunion, and you hear shit at the table, and it's like, you know what? Grandma is a bigot. Holy shit. It's like she says all this stuff that we should not be hearing. You need to stop Grandma. You need to actually tell her, hey, knock it off. Not cool anymore. Not acceptable. And it's, certainly tougher in the workplace, particularly if you're not in a position of power, but you need to stop the bias whenever you do hear it, because until you do that, it's just going to be perpetuated. So, going forward, what do we have to do? What do we need to think about? A lot of times, diverse employees have this sense of isolation. They don't feel that they belong in that environment that you're in, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's in a corporate environment. And even though many agencies do a great job in recruiting, bringing people in, bringing people to stay in their particular agencies, there needs to be more done to go ahead and make people feel included in that inclusion. So one thing that was interesting, just another fact or figure here, that survey completed, and this is both public and private sector, of about 4,000 respondents. This is bringing it back to the value of just diversity, inclusion, and ultimately belonging in your workforce, is that 4,000 respondents on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Following results. Majority of the population across the board, 78% said they felt like they could bring their authentic selves to work. Okay? And probably 74%, almost 75%, said that they felt like their perspectives actually mattered in their workplace. Now, interestingly enough, when they actually split up those respondents to the issue of specifically marginalized populations, Black, female, and other marginalized populations, easily 4 to 6 percentage points lower in feeling whether they were included, feeling that they were part of it. And what seemed to be perpetuated was that this is the intersectionality point, is that if maybe you have two aspects of your personality, of your life, that make you, if you're a woman of color, or if you're a Black gay man, you had increased exponentially percentages of people feeling less able to, one, bring their authentic selves to work, and two, feel that their positions actually mattered. So imagine somebody that's coming to the table with multiple, unpacking the proverbial knapsack of diversity and inclusion and equity, multiple aspects of their personality that they can't bring to the table. That's going to ultimately be reflected in how your workplace functions, the innovation that you have in your workplace, and ultimately your bottom line. So with that, I think, we're so far, I'm going to go ahead and say that Alyssa's going to knock it out of the park when she gives us some strategies and coming up. And Jill's going to wrap us up with some Q&A. That's also going to be awesome because just saw that, looking right now, the hashtag 47 is actually thinking that this is the top-notch session of this conference so far. And I'm sure it's because of all the people that are attending it and also all the people that are here on the panel. So with that, I will turn you over to Alissa for some strategies.
Thank you, Jim. Again, Alissa Barber Torres, always stuck following the guys with jokes. So, that's just my lot in life, I guess, but happy to be here with you again to highlight some strategies for action before, of course, our question and answer period, in which we hope to hear your strategies in which you found effective in your workplace. So looking again briefly at the Code of Ethics, what I want to highlight here is in the proposed changes that Jill touched on earlier, it asks us to accept our unique responsibility as a profession to eliminate historic patterns of inequity. And it is in that spirit that we offer the following strategies for planners to consider increasing equity, diversity, inclusion in our workplaces. So of course, volunteer to be a mentor. If we're increasing underrepresented groups in our profession, that's a key way to do it. There are several options here in the state, as well as APA National's Mentor Match, which several of us participate in. Commit to your own education with the resources out there, and I think Jim has highlighted very well for us how that can take place and some of the things you want to look at. APA's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion webpage has an updated list of sources for you, and we're happy to hear your own as well to contribute to that resource. As Jim highlighted, speaking up when you see inappropriate behavior, stereotyping, and this is my personal dislike, is when adults are called kids, or people hear, well, I have kids your age. And, again, maintaining respect for each of us in the workplace, that's a key one that can seem innocent, but is, very demeaning. And of course, actively working to create the culture of belonging that Jim referenced a moment ago by being an ally and advocate. And here is one definition of belonging to consider, and it's that security, support, that sense of being a true part and bringing an authentic self to a workplace or to a professional community. And of course, that's something to which we all aspire. For those of you who are managers, as Jim highlighted again, we have a unique responsibility and power to be able to make a difference in that space. Asking staff members for their feedback and suggestions is always a key way to hear their diverse perspectives and points of view. And reviewing your department's successes and needs as well in this area. Do your staff have equivalent workloads and growth opportunities? Who is leading projects, especially the high visibility ones, and who's getting promoted? Does everyone have access to professional development, training, networking, feedback, coaching, mentoring, all the things that help us succeed in the workplace and which should be equally available to all people there? Are you bringing various staff members to the leadership meetings and encouraging them to ask questions and share their perspectives? Again, that visibility can be so key to advancement, as well as mentoring and advocating for people in the workplace, given the position that you hold. And how are you selecting people to mentor, recommend, and advance through your own efforts? So we'd ask that you reflect on that for a moment before acknowledging any disparities identified by staff and committing to specific actions and timeframes for change to retain and build that trust in your workplace. Additional steps you may take as a manager are providing training to promote cultural sensitivity and avoiding bias, and using equitable and inclusive hiring practices. I won't go into this at length because, of course, Jim touched on it for a moment, but recruitment is a key part of that. Creating ads with only the job's truly required skills and needs. So if you're listing 45 things in there that you hope people will be able to do, research shows that that can be a deterrent for women to apply for those positions, because women tend to apply if they have most of the things listed, where statistically men tend to apply if they even have only a few of them. And that's a deeper issue, but again, listing only the things you absolutely need. And one of them as well is if you don't need people to lift certain weights, again, that can be a deterrent for people that have different abilities. And do you truly need people to lift those 50 pounds every week? If not, work with your HR to see if things like that can be left out. Avoiding gendered wording for desired attributes. If you're saying, leadership, take charge, or supportive, or, environment, team player, those can be codes to people of different genders to look at the positions differently. Including equal opportunity and non-discrimination and inclusivity statements can be key, especially given some of the things that may be listed there and how your potential applicants may relate to those from an identity standpoint. Using performance-based interviewing by a panel that scores responses neutrally against job performance criteria can be key to avoiding bias. That's the type of thing that helps prevent the I hire my bros that Jim touched on a moment ago. If you know you need certain things for a job, you have a consensus of a panel, and you're scoring against those specific needs, that can get turned down the impact of those gut feelings in the hiring process that can be such a barrier. Also, using your ad's standard criteria like years and types of experience to select applicants to interview, and interviewing all or most of the candidates that meet them. Yes, it's an additional burden on your time, but it's an important commitment to make sure that everyone has the access to the position or the promotion that you may be offering. And of course, being careful to follow all applicable laws and human resources policies, and that can be for things like a veteran's preference, for example, a key component of an equitable hiring process. Turning now to the work we do in communities, again, this should be a basic for all of us, but as a refresher, starting your project with the community and their many leaders, as Bob mentioned, to hear diverse values and needs, providing opportunities for different types of input at meetings and workshops, whether groups or individuals, and a wide variety of options that recognize people's diverse work schedules, third shifts, people that need to ride the bus to get there, and the group dynamics in terms of who holds power in these settings and of what type. I want to highlight here a great example featured in APA's equity webinars recently, the Charlotte Future 2040 project. 40 plus ways that they use to connect with people in the different communities in Charlotte and to do benchmarking as well, including things like TikTok videos, games, the things that challenge us to be more creative and more inclusive in our own projects in Florida. And of course, being transparent and documenting the input that you've received from everyone and how that affected the project to show that commitment and accountability. In communities, of course, you can also and should advertise participation with the appropriate disclaimers reflecting Title VI civil rights laws, ADA disclaimers, and a clear process to request the appropriate accommodations that participants may need. Using a microphone at meetings with no exceptions, again, for folks that have different abilities, very helpful and inclusive in that way. Here's one that may be new to some of you, ensuring event locations are fragrance-free. And the U.S. Access Board, which promulgates the ADA regulations, has a great model policy for that. And what can be the challenge there is, of course, many personal and commercial fragrance products are largely unregulated in this country, and they tend to cause things like migraines, asthma, and anaphylaxis for people like me that have chemical sensitivity. So we literally cannot linger in those spaces without risk. You don't want to prohibit people's participation in your meetings, and that can be a key element of ensuring that accessibility for all of us. Also, assessing non-English language needs and creating all products and hosting all events. There are federal requirements for limited English proficiency plans and services under Title VI, so it's important to know what your responsibilities are and how you can meet them. All agencies should have the appropriate plans and services to provide that access. And here's an example of an I Speak card where participants at meetings at your permit counter can indicate their language needs to be able to access the interpretation that they may need to be able to receive services from your government or to participate in the process in the way that federal law demands. And also benchmarking your input against community characteristics and environmental justice concerns. And if these are not things that your agency has actively engaged with in the past, I will note that under the new Biden administration, federal agencies are releasing a lot of new policies, hiring enforcement staff, and taking the appropriate actions to make sure that these federal laws are appropriately implemented. So now is the time to go back to your agency and make sure that you are fully compliant and have all the resources you need to do so. Again, more resources, and we're fortunate that APA National has put out many of them in recent years and continues to do so. You have the Planning for Equity Policy Guide, which is exceptional and has been highlighted in several of their programs recently. The new Diversity Climate Survey also offers an extensive resource list of initiatives and publications. It's basically a complete history of efforts, but also the way we need to go forward, and offers a lot of great suggestions that can be put into action in your workplace, not just academic settings. The Hindsight Conference that APA New York Metro Chapter and their Diversity Committee put on is really exceptional, and it's unfortunate this is going to be their last year of putting it on, but would encourage you to participate in that and to check out the YouTube videos of past sessions, which several of us on the EDI committee have attended those events and found them absolutely worthwhile and a model for what we all should be doing. And finally, the EDI committee has a resource list, as I mentioned, on the APA Florida website. We list a number of podcasts, videos, books, things to help us all have these conversations and do the work on ourselves and in the workplaces that we want and need to do. And we welcome your suggestions as to things that should be added there with a feedback form to share a resource. So with that, we're happy to turn it back over to Jill to be able to start the conversation, hear your questions, discussions, suggestions, strategies, and we thank you for joining our session today.
Thank you, Alissa. I should have mentioned at the beginning that our session is one of the sessions that's being recorded for people to view later. So if you have a question, I'm going to do my best to try to repeat the question just so the people watching this later understand what the question was before one of our panelists try to answer it. So before I jump into the questions I have, does anybody have anything right off the top that they are dying to ask or share? No? Oh.
Remember, microphones, no exceptions.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Jacob York. I'm a planning student at the University of Florida. I guess I had a question for the whole panel, but anyone who has expertise. It seems like there is a bit of a conflict between calls for densification and trans-oriented development and sustainable density, and the fact that many of these places, as mentioned, that are being kind of redeveloped are minority owned, and there seems to be this kind of inherent link between redevelopment and displacement. And I was curious, has there been any good examples where that has not been the case studies where there has been redevelopment without displacement, or ways to engage communities, in the inevitable change of the urban form?
Bob?
Oh, no. Yeah, mine's not working. I'm not sure that, I'm not sure, I should say sure. I haven't seen that happen. And interestingly, I know that APA a couple of years ago put out under the banner of equity, diversity, inclusion, a document that talked about redevelopment versus gentrification. And one of the things I remember from that was the idea that there was a thin line between what was considered redevelopment and gentrification, and that maybe what we should be doing as planners is helping to help people understand that redevelopment is good. And I got lost in the distinction. I really did. I've watched too many communities of color disappear under the rubric of redevelopment, under the guise of a community redevelopment agency, under the guise of I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And so the ways that you begin to deal with that is planning on behalf of that community, not doing as is happening here in Miami-Dade County with what used to be Little Haiti, where all of a sudden there's an overlay district that's going to help. Well, who's it helping? And so you plan for the residents, you create opportunities for ownership, you create opportunities for long-term retention of homes, whether it's through community land trust or other means of being able to build wealth, but also being able to help people that are at a lower AMI. And so can it be done? Yes. Have I seen it done? No.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a shameless announcement for my presentation tomorrow at 8:30. It's all about inclusive design, and we've done that work for years. I learned something today from Jim. I didn't know about the Capitol crawl. I'm embarrassed because I've actually done some universal design for the U.S. Capitol at the Capitol steps. So thank you for that. And whether the governor actually said it or not, this is one of the best presentations that I've seen at the conference. Thank you very much.
Anybody else?
Thanks for your patience, y'all. I'm doing the early Oprah here.
Good morning. My name is Dagmar Segarra. I'm planner for Seminole County. As you know, Florida is a fairly diverse state, but we still have a lot of conservative towns. Is there any advice for planners like me in the government that are seeking to expand that diversity, inclusion in our own departments and in our own communities? So we don't feel, because as we all know, when we make calls for community workshops, we see the same faces showing up, and typically projects are driven based on that feedback. What are the strategies, or I know you touched on some of them, but I would like to hear how we can try to make that push for our leaders or our politicians or county managers, city managers, and that we actually can have a voice or become the voice for those that we are trying to speak for.
I'll take a shot and then hand it over to Bob to actually answer the question. Basically, I think, it's some easy baby step stuff that doesn't always work, but I think if you at least got to try. Something as simple as if you keep seeing the same faces, and they're faces that are usually paid to be there, is like, well, a concept that's taken off in other locations, and I'm not sure how many times it's happened in Florida. I suspect, certainly hasn't happened in our community, but we're not that progressive. But it may happen elsewhere, is that you actually pay people for their input. You're not paying a market rate, but their time is valuable. Whether they're taking time away from their families, taking time away from their pastimes, hobbies, what have you. You basically pay almost community ambassadors to kind of take the torch and go ahead and get input in the community that way. I've seen that where there have been case studies that show that seems to be a trend that's picking up and seems to be working in some cases. I think from a practical standpoint, that's probably going to be a tough sell to your elected officials, just what I'm thinking, but it's a novel concept. The other thing is, again, silly, small, easy stuff that may not get traction initially is, you want more people to show up to the meeting, provide childcare. We tried that. We still don't have anybody coming to the meeting, but, at least it makes us feel like at least we're trying, so that somebody that may not have the ability to show up because they've got childcare responsibilities can attend the meeting and still, tend to whatever they need to tend to from a childcare standpoint, and they're not being left out of being able to participate. Ultimately, I think sometimes you just have to bring the meeting to them. You have to bring the meeting to the neighborhood. And as painful as that is for elected officials, as painful as that is, I mean, technically our legal counsel, our village attorney actually opined we couldn't do any more, for lack of a better term, we'll call them tours. We tried a couple times to actually take our elected officials on a kind of guided tour of certain communities and projects that were coming up and issues, and they opined that that was a problem based on some either between an AG opinion, but also some case law that prohibited us from doing that, because then it left other people out of a possible public meeting scenario, since that was a sunshine body, even if we noticed it and had the media available and all that kind of stuff. But bring the meeting to them, even if it's just from a staff standpoint. Bring the meeting to the neighborhoods, bring the meeting to the communities, so that there's actually some sense of investment, that you're not just making decisions for them, you're making decisions with them.
Jim answers the question. No, but for me, it is first a public participation implementation plan, or whatever word you want to try to use there. But basically, going to your supervisor and saying, we're not getting adequate representation, and I believe that here's a way for us to change the dynamic. Part of that is identifying who are the communities that are not there. And how can we reach them? What are the barriers to it? It may be date and time of the meeting. It may be the location of the meeting. It may be, even if it's date and time, I'll shout out to North Miami. I've worked with them, and in the past for things that were happening in North Miami, what they wind up doing was kind of a win-win, where they had local restaurants and caterers. They did tapas plates. So they only volunteered a certain amount. And so you have multiple vendors that were now being introduced to the community. So it's not, okay, come do business with us, come eat or hire us. But also what happening was you could have a meeting start at 6 o'clock in the evening, not doing it on evenings with church night or other types of things that are going on in the community, but that residents could come, they could bring their kids if they wanted to, and they didn't have to worry about being in a meeting that's going to go until 8, they get home at 9, and then they haven't had anything to eat. So figure out how to remove barriers, take it to them, figure out how to change how you're communicating. Don't wait until you have a major project that you're trying to implement, that you're now trying to do a downtown overlay, that you're now going to update the economic development element, and now it's time that you want public input and involvement. Involvement is an ongoing, continuous activity. You have to build the relationships, and as part of the building the relationships, do not ask people on behalf of what you're trying to accomplish for their input, without also asking them, what is it that you need and whether or not we can help. If it's not the planning department that can help, is it another department that can't help? Or another resource from the public sector, the private sector. So don't expect, it's like a quid pro quo. You're trying to, it's their community that you're asking them to help with, but at the same time, sometimes the priority that you have may be for that group, whether it is a community of color, people with disabilities, elderly, youth. What you're interested in may be very important to them, but there are 3 other things that are more important. Do you know what those are? And are you having that conversation with them?
Thanks. I'll go ahead and add to that. Again, thinking about the limited English proficiency plans that our agency should have in place. As Bob implies, there's a lot of preparation that goes into doing these things well, but also from a compliance standpoint in terms of having certain documents translated, for example, or lining up the services you need to have interpreters there. Because, of course, federal guidance discourages relying on people's own family members for those services. You are supposed to have people that are trained interpreters that can convey difficult or technical concepts. So really some of the practices that we see out there are not the model for how we should be going forward. And again, all of that takes preparation, and planners need to be an important part of meeting those needs to be able to make sure that we're meeting the responsibilities of the AICP Code of Ethics.
Anybody else? Any other questions? No. So we have about 5 minutes left. I also wear the hat of the Vice President of Certification Maintenance for APA Florida. So this is the last year that we will have to do an hour and a half of ethics. Next year we'll be just down to an hour. But so to take up the 5 minutes that we have left, I have a question for any of our panelists, and also if there's anyone in the audience who would like to share their perspective. So most of you probably know recently they released some of the first census data for the 2020 census. And one of the comments that I heard was that with the prior administration, there had been some back and forth. They wanted to expand the questions about race and ethnicity, and that didn't happen. And so one of the early results that they're seeing is that we're getting a lot of answers that are 2 or more races, but then we don't necessarily know what those 2 or more races are. And as I was thinking about what Bob was presenting, I thought it's important for us as planners, because I know a lot of us, we rely on census data so much in our jobs, but now how accurate of a reflection of our communities is it really? And so what has been anybody's experience with maybe moving beyond census data to try to better understand the demographics of your community? I don't know if anyone on the panel has.
I'll rely on Dr. Alissa Barber to help me with that one.
No, I would just offer one thought, and that's, of course, I think, as Jill mentioned, and Bob highlighted, there's a lot of richness in this data that we don't want to lose by trying to force it into a box that does not fit. And I think part of it, when we look at the attempt to add a Middle Eastern North African category to the census, that's one attempt to, again, get the richness of this identity and this detail. And I would just hesitate to kind of make sure that, well, our needs that we identify as planners at all constrain what people want to tell us about themselves and what they need. And I know especially too, I'm not Hispanic. Of course, my husband, a very proud Puerto Rican, considers being Latino his race. And of course, there's not a uniform approach to that. Many people of Hispanic or Latinx identity, may or may not view it that way. And I feel personally that it's important to recognize that and affirm it and not try to make it too tidy for purposes that we think we have, but that really may not serve, our mission and values in the way that we need to.
The only thing I would add to that is that, yes, the census is not necessarily the best way of reflecting the composition of your community. For instance, just in terms of LGBTQ people, in 2010, there was a census question that attempted to capture whether or not there were LGBTQ persons living in a community. The question basically was, are you same-sex and married? Well, in 2010, not all states, marriage was allowed at that time. The other thing, even for people that answered the question, for instance, I believe the response in Florida, there were 48,500 same-sex married couples in Florida, out of a population at that time in 2010, I forgot how many million. And so what has happened is you have to rely on interested entities. The Williams Institute, which is part of the UCLA Law School, is dedicated to doing research regarding LGBTQ persons. And so what they've been able to do is they took that data for each state and they've extrapolated from that and said, here are the number of LGBTQ persons that are living in each state, and they even broke it down by county. You can go to their website and see how many people are in your county here in Florida. If I remember correctly, I think the estimate in 2010 was like 770,000 LGBTQ plus persons in the state of Florida, or 4.5% of the population. So unfortunately, the old thing about there's 10% of us, they're trying to do away with that. They just keep, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna go with that joke. But 4.5%, and so what you have to, basically, if the census is not doing it, there are groups out there that are doing a better job of giving you data for different demographics, because that's who they're representing and that's who they're advocating for. So research and find those based on the identity or identities that you're trying to get a better understanding about.
Thank you. Does anybody in the audience have any suggestions, anything they've done? Yes?
Another source, hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Another source is through the school district, the local school district, for English language learners and or English speakers of other languages. Many school districts have been dealing with those issues long before it's been recognized, the importance. And you can find pockets within your community speaking to either race and or ethnicity and or cultural differences.
Thank you. Yeah, so just for the sake of the recording, she was recommending the school district, who has a lot of information about languages and race. Anybody else? All right, we have 10 seconds left, so I want to thank all the panelists for all their presentations and thank all of you for coming today. Don't forget to log your credits.